and welcome to this week's edition of Rating the News. My name is Vanessa Otero. I'm the founder and CEO of Ad Fontes Media. Our company creates the famous media bias chart, and this week's topic is a State of the Union by Joe Biden last week. And we're going to cover a couple of articles, one from the left and one from the right. So we're going to cover an article from Jacobin magazine and an article from National Review, talking about the State of the Union. Now, as you can imagine, from the left and the right, anytime there's a State of the Union, it's sort of predictable that the left and right media has different takes and different spins on it. But we want to use this particular type of event that happens sort of all the time to examine some concepts in reliability and bias. Particularly when we talk about bias, we want to talk about degrees of left and right bias. On our media bias chart, there are things that are middle and then skews left and right and hyperpartisan left and right and things that are most extreme left and right. So what are the factors that make us rate them? What's the difference between something that's just skews right or hyperpartisan right or even further extreme than that? We're going to discuss that. Then we're also going to talk about the difference between what makes something a good analysis and what makes it more opinionated, because that's a gradient in the middle of our scale. And those aren't always things that we're attuned to detecting. So let me just show you the articles that we're going to go over. First one here is from Jacobin, and the title is Biden's State of the Union was a paean to liberalism's complacent status quo. And then we've got the National Review. The title is Biden fails to reboot his presidency. Now, what's interesting about each of these articles or each of these publications is that they're fairly well respected by people on the sides that they appeal to. So Jacobin is a self-described socialist magazine and strongly advocates for a very far political left, especially in the United States, political positions, including socialism. And on the right, National Review is regarded by conservatives as a well done, well-reasoned, very conservative, right-leaning analysis publication, right? So, we're not going to see utter garbage or trash that's sort of easy to detect. The prose tends to be a little bit nicer. It tends to be a little bit more well written than things that are just the most clickbaity and offensive from the bottom corners of the chart. So let's take a look at what makes something left and what makes something right, and examine these different takes on the State of the Union. Okay, so Jacobin, we already know from the About section that they describe themselves as a socialist magazine, but the title here, Biden's State of the Union was a paean to liberalism's complacent status quo. You can start to see, okay, liberalism. So liberalism's complacent status quo. Well, let's dissect this first a little bit. You may not know what the term paean means. I kind of know what it was, but I needed to look it up. A song of praise or triumph, okay? Things that express enthusiastic praise. All right. So the State of the Union was enthusiastic praise by Biden to liberalism's complacent status quo. So complacent is not a complimentary term. So we can detect that this article is sort of attacking liberalism itself. And because we know this is the self-described socialist magazine, I am anticipating an attack on liberals by a further left faction than liberals. All right, so let's take a look at the lead here. In his first State of the Union address, Joe Biden commendably stuck to most of the progressive policy stances he campaigned on in 2020. Okay, so they're saying it's commendable when he talks about progressive policy stances, and progressive is typically politically further left in the United States than just liberal. But he steered clear of identifying or pointing fingers at those culpable for the injustices he claims he wants to remedy. So the thing they didn't like was that he didn't point the finger at people whose fault it was that that more liberal or progressive things are not happening. All right. So what does that have to do with our bias rating? So when we look at bias, a lot of people just think about political position as bias, and that's part of it, but language is also a part of it. But within language, there are a couple of types of language that we're talking about. Okay, so when we talk about political position, on the left, like what anchors this line, this 18 line between skews left and hyperpartisan left in our system, that's like the median position of elected Democrats. And so Joe Biden's political positions in this case would be like squarely minus 18, right in between skews left and hyperpartisan left. Like that's Democratic politics in the United States right now. Whereas on similarly on the right, the line between skews right and hyperpartisan right would be the positions of elected officials that are sort of in the middle of the Republican Party. So in an article that advocates for a further left political position than median political Democrats would be start to get into this hyper-partisan left area. That's for political position. Okay, let's leave that there for a second. And we're also going to talk about language. So what do we mean by language? Well, there's adjectives and adverbs. Those can be used by either side. Like how harsh and how descriptive the adjectives and adverbs are can be a factor in language, but also the terms that are used to describe the political positions. And so there's terminology that's favored by centrists. There's terminology that's favored by the left and the right. So let's keep looking at this article, and what about this Jacobin article that makes it more or less left bias? Like, where do we want to put this? Do we want to put this at skews left, right in the middle between hyperpartisan left and skews left, or hyperpartisan left? So those with a favorable opinion of Joe Biden will have found plenty to like about his first State of the Union address. And what's nice is that they link to the State of the Union address transcript that's provided by the New York Times. Whenever we're talking about a speech, we want to know if they reference the speech. Sometimes we want to be able to fact check that. So it's nice to be able to check a transcript. Okay. In the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a Biden speech retained the general thrust of his domestic agenda and reiterated his commitment to key democratic priorities, offering a laundry list of appeals attractive to the party's base. All right, so that's we want to start analyzing a couple of things. One, how far left for bias, and the grade of analysis, like the quality of analysis. If we go back to our rubric over here, you'll notice that there's a couple of categories for analysis and opinion. So up here between 40 and 48, we're talking about complex analysis. And then between 32 and 40 is analysis. So it's usually simpler analysis of what we're referring to. And then between 24 and 32, we're talking about opinion. So sometimes, people just lump everything into opinion. It's biased. It's, advocating for a position, therefore it's opinion. But we want to be able to tell the difference between a better argued opinion and a worse argued opinion. So what are the things that make opinions analysis better and worse? What makes something more like analysis, higher up, and less like opinion? And what we want to look at are the facts that are used to support the arguments. And when we want to detect what actual arguments are being made, we're looking for certain types of sentences. Those types of sentences include conclusions, statements of meaning, predictions, and inferences. Right. So when you're talking, and this is really common when it comes to political arguments, because in political arguments, people like to talk about causation, like this policy or this fact caused this conclusion. Or that like the cause and effect is common in political arguments. And so bear with me here for a little bit. When we talk about causation, usually the closer a fact is tied to a cause is tied to an effect, the easier it is and more people agree that there's causation. The farther apart those things are in terms of like time and relevance, the less people will agree about actual causation. So if you think of an example of a car accident, like proving causation in court, if you say, driver A was speeding and ran a red light and hit driver B in a car, more people will accept, driver A's actions caused the car accident. Say driver A is 25 years old, and you could also say that drivers A's parents met, 25 years ago or more. And if they hadn't met, then like them meeting actually caused this car accident 25 years later. Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a line of causation, but it's not as direct. So there's less agreement on it. So what that looks like in political arguments is if you say things like more government spending causes inflation, there are people who accept that argument, but then there are folks that will disagree with it because there's other lines of causation in between that, right? Or that raising the minimum wage reduces poverty. There are people who will agree with that because there are things you can draw lines of causation, but there are other things that you can point to for causation as well. So, and just keep that in mind. We're looking for closeness of facts to conclusions, inferences, and statements of meaning. Okay, so this sentence, in the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, that's a good summary sentence, factual. Notably, the president again endorsed a potentially transformative PRO Act. What's that? Looks like it is a ambitious labor law reform. So again, pro labor law. That's a left-leaning position. He called for a $15 minimum wage and the extension of the poverty fighting the recently expired child tax credit. So they're saying $15 minimum wage fights poverty, sort of this tax credit. He talked about voting rights and called on corporate America and its wealthy to pay their fair share. All right, so let's look at the term corporate America. So corporate America, that's terminology that we've heard, progressives will use it, liberals will use it also. So when we're talking about like how far left that language is with corporate America, I mean, I think it's still pretty like, middle of the road for Democrats, right? Maybe a little further left, maybe like would Joe Biden himself say corporate America? Maybe sometimes. But let's talk about he did say asking the wealthy to pay their fair share. That's a thing that Joe Biden would say. He spoke about reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a terminology that's I think a little bit more associated with a little bit further left positions. So often access to healthcare or reproductive rights would be a more common term for like abortion care. Reproductive justice maybe a little bit further left, not too extreme though. And the ongoing offensives against Roe v. Wade and the basic dignity of transgender people. Okay, so again, this is on our language scale, still in this area, not too extreme. Let's take a look at. All right, so the force of these remarks, it must be said, was somewhat blunted by a more emblematic streak of triangulation, most visibly around the issue of policing, which saw Biden quite brazenly default to the law and order rhetoric that has often defined his political career. So now he's saying they brazenly defaulted to law and order rhetoric. That doesn't sound complimentary. So it sounds attacking on Joe Biden's position around policing. More importantly, though, it was a speech heavy on liturgy, but lacking a compelling overall narrative. So that's just generally critical of the speech, not necessarily left or right. But Biden did sound progressive notes and alluded to real injustices. So they like that, like more progressive stuff that he talks about, but his remarks failed to hint at any overarching story about where they came from and why they persist. So they want to talk about causation and wish Joe Biden has talked about the causation and root problems of the things that he's talking about. In Biden's telling, climate change is real and Americans deserve better health care and cheaper prescription drugs. Better health care and cheaper prescription drugs, those things are like political position wise. Again, it's going to be like median Democratic positions. Working families need a raise and corporations need to pay higher taxes. Americans' democratic institutions are under threat and police departments need to be more accountable. Yet in each instance, the president's words seem to come with a qualifier or omission that sapped their effect. Who or what, it could reasonably ask, is actually causing climate change? This is an interesting line of attack that there are parts of Joe Biden's speech where he like overtly appealed to being bipartisan, and this article is attacking him for not speaking out about whose fault it is or what are the root causes of these problems that Joe Biden is trying to address. So that's further left than Joe Biden. By the same token, what is it about for-profit pharmaceutical companies that encourages price gouging and deprives desperate people of urgently needed drugs? Wealthy Americans have been pampered with useless tax cuts, but all right, so that's a standard Democratic left position still. But Biden took pains to assure those with cash-strapped incomes of $400,000 a year that they won't pay a cent more, and the same corporations he suggested were engaging in monopolism that he wasn't out to punish anybody. Okay. He alluded to the Disclose Act, the need for Americans to know who is funding our elections, yet said nothing about the very corporate capture of Congress responsible for stifling his own agenda or the obstructive institutions currently empowering the right and suppressing democratic majority rule. So each of one of these complaints about what's causing climate change, complaints about the pharmaceutical companies, complaints about wealthy Americans, complaints about corporations, and the corporate capture of Congress and lack of transparency. The theme here is why there wasn't enough blame. Okay, this is not ultimately an indictment of Biden's speechwriters, but rather a deeper statement about the contradictory posture of American liberalism and its political vessel, the Democratic Party. So here they're just saying squarely the problem is that liberalism and the Democrats are just not capable of getting done the actual things that they say they want to get done, according to progressives. In the contemporary liberal imagination, disparate problems and injustices exist, but with systemic diagnoses more or less ruled out, their roots and causes must remain forever ethereal. All right, so these are big conclusions and inferences and statements of meaning about all the things that cause that cause tension between progressives and the Democratic Party. And when you've got these sentences that are like big statements of inference, those lend it more to opinion. Okay. Now there are certainly some here we haven't detected any lies, any inaccuracies, right? But the things that they're talking about that cause climate change, cause price gouging, cause the corporate capture of Congress and Congress responsible for stifling his own agenda. Those are they're broad. They're not necessarily discrete things that happen. They're summaries of facts, summaries of things that have happened that are debated among people on the left and right, right? They're not all widely accepted. So they're saying, here's my premise, here's what's causing stuff, here's the effect, and here's my statement of meaning and inference about it. These are the statements of meaning and inferences about that. So that lends it more to a lower level of analysis, more towards opinion. Okay. All right. Steeped in deference toward the inherent wisdom of the market and the intrinsic nobility of standing institutions, Biden's brand of centrist progressivism can thus imagine lower drug prices and recognize the pain caused by long illness, but cannot fathom a system in which healthcare is a right removed from considerations of profit altogether. All right, there's a lot to unpack in this sentence. All right, so they're saying that Biden's brand of centrist progressivism, that's clearly from this sentence, you can see that that's like they don't agree with his brand of centrist progressivism. Okay. And it's steeped in deference toward the inherent wisdom of the market and the intrinsic nobility of standing institutions. All right. So it sounds like this author doesn't believe that like the wisdom of the market is a valid concept, or that there is intrinsic nobility of standing institutions. And so like if you go back to the title, like status quo, that these types of phrases, complaining about the status quo, saying that like there's no such thing as like wisdom of the market or nobility of standing institutions. Those are further left political positions. Those are further left political phrases. That's language that's used to attack liberalism, which is like a more centrist version on the left than progressivism, which is further left. So we're starting to see that in terms of both language, this is drifting further left, language characterizing the political positions, like being anti-status quo, further left, being anti, wisdom of the market, further left. Political position, also further left than center, because they're saying liberalism, this middle position, is not good, needs to be further left, right? That's why we start putting these things over in this hyper-partisan left category, rather than just like in the middle of the left spectrum. Okay. Now, keep in mind, there are other reasons that the articles can be biased to the left for language reasons, like name calling or like really harsh adjectives. We're not really seeing that here, right? The language that's over to the left that we're talking about is just the terminology that's being used to describe political positions. Okay, so like saying healthcare is a right, again, that's a thing that like Bernie Sanders and other progressives say, further to the left than centrist Democrats, cannot be removed from considerations of profit altogether. So, if you read a lot of articles that are progressive, socialist, leftist, however people on the further left define themselves, you'll hear terms like, the premise that capitalism even works is highly under question, right? So saying that like healthcare needs to be removed from the considerations of profit. It can acknowledge the science of climate change, yet it cannot identify extractive capitalism as its root, right? So here is again a big causation argument. They're saying extractive capitalism causes climate change, right? And there are certainly people who agree with that, but that's disputed, right? That when you have a thing, like when you say this big thing causes this other thing, and there's lots of disputes, and you can certainly use arguments to prove and disprove that fact or that connection. That brings it more into the realm of opinion, because there are so many arguments you can make just around that one sentence. Like you could have a whole debate between Republicans and Democrats, or really far left and really far right people, about does extractive capitalism cause climate change, right? Whole debate. When things are really widely debated like that, when these statements are ones themselves that could be really widely debated and are not intrinsically true or false according to everyone, then that puts it over in the analysis section. So we're mostly talking about expression here, right? So we're talking about analysis, or like analysis opinion. And so at the moment, I've got it pretty squarely between analysis and opinion on the scale. Like right at 32 overall for reliability. Okay. All right. It can declare the need for transparency about the special interests that have long funded both major parties, but stops well short of demanding any actual end to the corruption. It can grasp the grotesque brutality of police chokeholds, but has no conceptions of alternatives to the bankrupt law and order politics of the 1980s and 90s. It can softly indict large companies for price gouging or union busting, but cannot signal out the financial incentives driving them as the ultimate cause, right? So another argument, like financial incentives of capitalism of large companies are the ultimate cause of large companies doing price gouging, which is bad, and union busting, which is bad. Like, so again, this cause and effect, a thing that's disputed, a thing that would be more opinionated. In short, it's a style of politics incapable of embracing the means necessary to realize even its own stated ends. All right. So, at this point, like if you look at like what facts were used to make the arguments, to make the inferences and statements of meaning and conclusions. What we see here is that there are a lot of inferences and statements of meaning and conclusions that are not very closely tied to the facts. I mean, the facts that are cited are not really facts. They're themselves opinions, right? For example, the root of climate change is extractive capitalism. That's an argument. So what underlies the arguments about like why Joe Biden's speech was a paean to liberal status quo is that what it relies on are the arguments. These are arguments that are really widely accepted on the left, like by readers of this magazine. They're like, yes, they just like take it for granted that like these are the causes of climate change and profit for pharmaceutical companies and for police brutality. Like that's just sort of taken as a fact and taken as given, but that's not actually underlying facts. Those are underlying opinions and assumptions. So when we're talking about like whether this is more analysis or opinion, that has us bring it down further into opinion, right? It's mostly inferences and statements of meaning. There are very few like, this is a fact, like these are what things that he said. Like he said, like at the very beginning, there are some facts about what happened in the State of the Union, but the rest of it is arguments, right? So you've got one paragraph of facts, like this is what Joe Biden said, and the rest of the paragraph is mostly arguments. And as we went through, we saw that they are pretty squarely hyper-partisan, left of center, not calling for, not overtly calling for the end of capitalism here, but this is a situation where pretty much the language and the political position and the comparison factors would all line up pretty closely. So we'd put it an overall score, hyperpartisan left opinion. All right. Even though it has like nice words, I mean, it's not rude. It's advocacy. It's arguing for a certain point of view. So you can see like, if you already agree with these underlying arguments, you'd be like, this is a great article. I'm just going to go with that. Now let's take a look at the National Review and what people on the right who like this publication would see. All right. So Biden fails to reboot his presidency. That's an opinion statement already about the State of the Union itself. Like that is a conclusion. Like it's no statement of like what actually happened. It is a conclusion of like what the effect of the State of the Union entire speech was. Biden fails to reboot his presidency is by the editors, and often editors when it's written by the editorial staff, they feel like they just have license to write an opinion, and they can do whatever they want. President Biden headed into a State of the Union address, and what's interesting is like the Jacobin article cited the State of the Union address and linked to a transcript in New York Times, right? This one links to State of the Union address. It links to another article on National Review about how the State of the Union address was terrible, right? So a little bit more opinionated already, but let's go. In deep political trouble. Again, this is a conclusion, and they're going to use some arguments or facts or some things to support that conclusion. His inept handling of a mounting crisis. So here you see an adjective. Inept is fairly harsh, not a kind adjective. If you call somebody inept on the left or the right, that's like that's pretty harsh. Like it's pretty partisan to call somebody inept. All right, but let's leave language here at 18, like right in the middle for now. Okay. Handling a mounting crisis has left his approval rating struggling to stay above 40%. So that's a fact that they are pointing to. And you can find opinion polling that currently that says that is true, right? So that's a fact that he's using. And then a number that sets Democrats up for potentially devastating losses in November's midterm election. All right, so that's a fact plus an inference, like what or a statement of meaning, like. This number, 40%, means that Democrats are set up for potentially devastating losses in November's midterm election. Now, that's actually pretty close. That's a fact that's like tied pretty close to an analysis. Like you would find that Democratic pundits would say similar things. 40% is a bad approval number and would portend midterm election losses if you look at things historically, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So as far as an analysis, that's a fairly strong fact to support an analysis. Okay. So you got inept handling and mounting crises. A number is opinionated, but this 40% is an analysis, but it's a right-leaning analysis because they already said he's deep political trouble, inference, inept, opinion, and then analysis here. That's right-leaning. All right. However, how right-leaning is it, right? So far, we haven't seen anything that's like out of the ordinary from like what any mainstream elected Republican would say. Like you can imagine Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy saying these things about Joe Biden. Like, yep, he's inept, struggling. Democrats are going to lose. So when we're talking about political position, right now we're sort of right in the middle between skews right and hyperpartisan right, just right in that median line. Yet, given the major stage of a joint session of Congress and a national audience, Biden made no effort to significantly change the trajectory of his presidency. So that's a statement of meaning. That's an inference. That's a conclusion that like he made no effort to change the trajectory of his presidency. What are they pointing to as a fact for that? Just nothing, right? There's no fact underlying that conclusion. Instead, he acted as if his first year in office was a smashing success and desperately tried to resell a dead agenda. Okay, so saying that he acted as if his first year in office was a smashing success, they haven't pointed to anything in his actual speech that supports this assertion, right? Saying that he's acting. I mean, is he really acting? Like maybe he actually thinks that some of the things he did were successful, and desperately tried to resell a dead agenda. So you desperately is again not a kind adjective to use here, but it's not like the worst. Calling a politician desperate on the left, if you imagine this term used for a left-leaning politician, that's not a super terrible adjective. So we've got inept, we've got desperately. For language, it's like, not kind, but not like super mean either. Resell a dead agenda. That's characterization. Again, sort of in the theme, in line with the bias of the other sentences. Biden opened his speech with words of support for Ukraine and tough talk directed at Vladimir Putin that was mostly well received by members of both parties. Okay, that's a summary. That's like fairly straightforward. It doesn't seem to be like words of support for Ukraine, tough talk directed at Vladimir Putin. You could argue that there's a little bias there, but that's fairly it's minimal. And then they include, though it came as nearly 6 out of 10 Americans say that Putin's decision to invade was triggered by sensing weakness in Biden. Okay, so they're pointing to a fact. Now, what's the relevance of this fact here? Like, what's the purpose of like throwing this? Let's assume this is a fact into the sentence. It's like, yes, both parties did like the things he said about Ukraine and Putin, right? But they immediately detract from it by saying that, like, well, it's probably his fault anyways, right? That's what this the citation of this this particular statistic intends to do, right? To detract from a thing that was good, like they admit is, like, well received by both members of Congress. Right. So what is this poll? It's another site to National Review. Internal sites to your own thing that's already partisan, like, doesn't help the like nonpartisan nature of it doesn't help the bias score, right? So if it's like, really super right-leaning article and then it cites its own self, it's going to retain a very similar bias score. So it says 62% of Americans say Putin wouldn't be invading if Trump were president. If you read this, it says a new Harvard Caps Harris poll released Friday found that 62% of those polled believe Putin would not be moving against Ukraine if Trump had been president. All right. So that believed Putin would not be moving against Ukraine if Trump had been president is like how they stated that in the question. When looking at strictly 85% of Republicans and 38% of Democrats answered this way. A majority of Americans, 59%, also they believe that the Russian president moved on Ukraine because Putin saw weakness in President Biden. All right, so that poll, let's take it for what it says, is true, but then they characterize it in like less kind ways. 38% of Democrats think Trump would have prevented this. I don't know that that's what they mean by saying that Trump would have prevented this. There are Democrats who would argue there are, like, so after our 6 full years of blanket press coverage calling Trump a pawn of Putin and saying, Democrats and their pundit and activist class have argued that this would have been much worse if that Putin stooge, Donald Trump, were still in charge. Okay. So they say that Democrats are saying most Democrats are saying this would be much worse if Trump was in charge. But then they say they use this result to say 38% of Democrats think Trump would have prevented this. I don't know that you can make that assert. That's like a valid assertion that Democrats think Trump would have prevented this, given that they admit that many Democrats say the opposite, like it would have been worse. Like maybe like the other less charitable assumption is that many Democrats think like Putin would think Trump's like kind of crazy, so maybe he wouldn't have invaded because of that, right? Let's go back to this article. So, this fact, they do use a fact to support they're not even really using a fact to support their conclusion. They're throwing in a fact that's not really relevant to this statement. Like, Biden opened his speech with words of support for Ukraine and tough talk directed at Vladimir Putin that was mostly well received by members of both parties. Then they throw a thing in that says, actually, people think it's his fault, right? So that goes to bias because the relevance of that particular fact, it's not particularly relevant to what like they're reporting on the State of the Union, but they're using that to support the opinion. Okay. All right, let's go. Biden launched into a long defense of trillions of dollars in spending programs he passed last year as part of the COVID relief package and the infrastructure law. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. Like, he did say that. Instead of outlining a legislative strategy to move beyond the Build Back Better bill, which Senator Joe Manchin killed late last year, Biden simply rebranded the bill. He didn't mention the actual name of the bill and then absurdly described it as his plan to fight inflation and claimed it would lower costs and reduce deficits. All right. So that's a characterization, not a terribly unfair characterization. He did talk about aspects and parts of the bill and his plan, right? So he's talked about that before, like taking aspects of the Build Back Better bill that are popular and trying to pass those independently. And then he said he didn't mention the actual name of the bill. And absurdly described it as his plan to fight inflation. So you've got absurdly in here as a pretty strong adjective. sort of like inept. So we're going back to adjective, pretty strong adjective to say that like his political position is absurd. But that this position that, Biden's position is absurd is a pretty standard political right position that would be taken up by median Republicans. So we're leaving it right here in the middle. Okay. And claimed it would lower costs and reduce deficits. In reality, government subsidies do not reduce actual prices. Okay. So this is an example on the right of an argument that's accepted just as if it is fact among people on the right. Like in reality, government subsidies do not reduce actual prices. Okay. That's a, cause and effect claim about like the effect of government subsidies on actual prices. So that's it's not a fact they're relying on. It's an opinion that they're relying on to make the statement of meaning and the inference. Like this would not, they're saying like, we're just taking it for granted that this plan would not work. Like our assumption is this is not going to work because in reality, government subsidies do not reduce prices. You're not going to find agreement on that across the political spectrum. Like not everybody regards that underlying claim as a fact. Therefore, it's an opinion. And the CBO found that his plan would add $160 billion to the deficit. Let's just assume that that's true. Again, it's an internal site, but I don't have reason to doubt this. This also inherently assumes that adding to the deficit it causes inflation as well, right? You would have Democrats argue that there are other causes of inflation, particularly COVID and the effect on the current supply chain, right? Therefore, the facts that they're using are still opinions. Like there's an underlying fact, so underlying fact is CBO said that they would add $160 billion to the deficit. The assumption is that adding to the deficit doesn't reduce inflation. There's not wide agreement around that. Therefore, that's an opinion. All right. As ridiculous as it was to brand and it says ridiculous. Okay. So again, absurd, inept, ridiculous. These are, not kind adjectives that are putting this over into the opinion section. Okay. And because the analysis, should it be analysis or should it be opinion? Well, the facts what are the facts that we've, that are in here so far, right? There's this fact about, for approval rating at 40%. Okay. It's used to support one claim. Then there's this other fact about the polling, but that fact doesn't really support the argument. It just that fact is in there to illustrate, to prove a point that Joe Biden's terrible or something. And then this fact about the CBO would add, it said his plan would add 160 billion to the deficit. It's an underlying fact, but the rest of the stuff that's in here is assumptions, right? Assumptions that are accepted by this audience, by the right-leaning audience that is reading this. So again, similar to the Jacobin article, if you're on the right, you're thinking, this is a pretty good opinion. This is a take. I agree with the underlying assumptions. I agree, right? This is my news. Let's go back to this. So whether it's analysis or opinion, there's not a ton of it's not really dense with facts. It's dense with a lot of adjectives, and it's dense with a lot of arguments that are supported by other underlying assumptions that are not widely accepted. So we have this in the opinion section as well. So a couple more things. So ridiculous. Biden did himself a few moments later when he called for a $15 minimum wage, just assumption that is a terrible idea. Whereas in the assumption in here, the assumption here is he called for a $15 minimum wage in the Jacobin magazine. They're like, that is good. And the assumption here is he outdid himself because, wow, that's a bad idea. To the extent that Biden attempted any pivot, it came on the issue of COVID. Last week, the CDC completely overhauled its guidance for masking right in time for the State of the Union. That's a little dig there, saying that like, oh, it did it because of the State of the Union. Like that's not supported. That's an assumption. Without any underlying change in the number of infections to the country, the CDC went from declaring 95% of the U.S. That's a site, external site to AP, a reliable source of the U.S. to be at significant enough risk to continue imposing mask mandates, to saying that 70% of the country was at low enough risk to rip off the masks. So, there are underlying facts here, but there are a lot of assumptions of like why the CDC made that change. There are a lot more charitable assumptions about and reasoning why the CDC made that change. Not that it's ones that are like not political and ones that are based on many states and governors have made this change already. We're at different phases of the pandemic. Lots of people are vaccinated. Lots of people have already had COVID and have some natural immunity. Cases are declining. There's a lot of reasons for this change, but then this organization of the syntax here, like the structure here, is that it implies that the CDC did it in time for the State of the Union, like so Biden would have something good to say, that nothing changed from one day to another, except for the CDC and how they define stuff. And so like they're implying that nothing changed, but they just said no masks, which is not exactly accurate. And then Biden, who pushed masking and supported the teachers' unions in their fight to delay school reopenings, touted the ability of the country to remove masks and the importance of in-person school. All right, so to this audience, somebody who pushed masks and supported teachers' unions, that's like the assumption is that like those are just not those are not good things. But these are again standard, like middle of the road Republican positions by elected officials today. It's not like more extreme than any like median Republicans. Like think of Ron DeSantis, right? That would be definitely like his position. Same with other elected officials around the country. So his change in tone had nothing to do with progress, but the fact that Democrats lost an election in Virginia and polling continued to show endless restrictions hurting Democrats. There's a conclusion. There's a statement of meaning, but what is it based on, right? Like this is saying that like, Biden's move towards no mask, which is a thing that we Republicans writing this was only done for cynical election reasons, because this is hurting them in the polls. You would not find wide support between cause and effect among a lot of folks, right? You would among Republicans, not among Democrats. So again, this is an opinion. So over here, we've got it sort of in the same opinion section as we had the Jacobin article, right? Because there were just not a ton of facts supporting the conclusions. It was a ton of conclusions, right? But as far as political position, this one's not as far right over as the Jacobin one is far as left, because Jacobin article was an attack on the left from the left, and this is an attack on Joe Biden just from the like regular right. Those are the sort of differences that we're looking for between like analysis and opinion, and how far left and how far right we want to put something. Now, this is, I think, instructive when you have people who think of themselves as like very politically savvy, reasonable, and like well-educated and well-informed. This is the kind of content that those folks read, right? It's not rude. It's not a lot of name calling. It's got like some jabs in there with the adjectives that can be a bit harsh. But then they take a lot of underlying assumptions that their own side agrees with and use them to further the same arguments. So you can see how like if you only inhabit that world of National Review and similar publications, or you only inhabit that world of Jacobin and similar publications, you have a real hard time seeing what the other side thinks of it, right? Because, and if you didn't watch the State of the Union, and you only read these two articles, that's what you would think about what was said in the State of the Union. There's very little primary sourcing here. There's very little there's very little of the actual what happened and what Joe Biden said in the State of the Union. And we want to, at Ad Fontes Media, we value primary sources and the telling of who, what, when, where, and the relevant why highest, right? If you can look at what the underlying thing of what happened yourself, and then make the decisions yourself based on your own beliefs and what you know of the world, rather than relying on opinions. Like, these are both squarely opinion articles that are, over to the left and over to the right, then you can make better informed decisions about the world. And that is Rating the News, State of the Union edition. See you next week.